Constanze Stelzenmüller, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institute. Constance, we're here in Washington, D.C. at the Brookings Institute. Everything is very civilized. Outside, the world's on fire. What's going on?
All right, then there's two aspects to this, but which are interrelated. One is the rise of populism, and particularly of right-wing populism across the West, with distinct elements of xenophobia, anti-Islamism, ethno-chauvinism, a distaste for the institutions and processes of representative democracy. Some would characterize that accurately, in my view, as Pluto-populism, because there seem to be an awful lot of millionaires involved, at least trying to run these things. And on the other hand, we've had a series of crises in the West and of overextended wars, which I think have also fueled this feeling. So there's an interconnection between what's happening domestically and what's happening externally. If I had to put the strategic framing into one sentence, I would say we have seen a move from a framing of global competition and cooperation to one of great power competition. And that has found its current apogee in the American national security strategy of the Trump administration, where that has been set as the administration's way of seeing the world. And of course, for us Europeans, the question is, in that framing, are we a subject? Are we still an ally, or are we an object?
But you can have healthy democracies within a zero-sum international system, can't you? There's no reason why democracy can't flourish if countries compete over resources.
Well, and arguably you could say that countries have always competed, and that the paradigm, the liberal paradigm of collaboration and cooperation was always one that was, somewhat limited to the West, and in general was more honored in the breach than in the observance. However, I think that to the extent that this zero-sum competitive thinking also quite explicitly describes itself as an end to humanist universalism, to the notion that basic human rights are the due and part of the due of every human being, and part of what we think of as human dignity, and part of the lessons we have learned from the world wars of the 20th century. There, I think you get into the populist territory. There you start seeing these things flowing together in sort of one toxic groundswell.
What do you make of the sort of the populist argument, at least in Europe, that it's always been very convenient for Americans to believe in the international system because they prosper from it?
Well, I would say that few have prospered the way we have, and certainly none have
prospered.
We
mean Germany?
We Europeans, and I was about to add, and none in Europe have prospered from this as much as Germany. For one, the American nuclear umbrella and America's stewardship of a rules-based international order allowed Europeans to focus on rebuilding themselves after World War II. The Germans in particular were able to focus not just on the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, what the French call the Trente Glorieuses, but on, as it were, shifting funding from defense into the social contract, and thereby, as it were, buying themselves social stability and the time to build out their institutions, which they did very carefully. And so, if anybody's profited from this, it's us. And I think that, frankly, the Americans have been entirely right, and not just Trump, but his predecessors, to say that we've been free riding on this, and that does need to change if we're to be taken seriously.
How do you analyze this seemingly parallel development of populism in the US and Europe? They're obviously connected. Is there a causal relationship, or are they just growing, the populist movements, are they growing simultaneously in Europe and in the US?
Well, I mean, this unfortunately gets us a little bit into the territory of cod psychology, which I try to avoid. But let me take a shot at this. Cod psychology. In other words, of psychologizing. But let me try and give you what I think is my best analysis, which is this. I think that one of the great analytical mistakes of the time after 1989, and nowhere was this mistake embraced more passionately than in Germany, was to think that the events of 1989, far from being a historical accident, were some kind of a benevolent fate showing that future would be from now on linearly progressive, and that the rest of the world would want to be like us. In other words, the global middle class, would eliminate poverty, and that everybody would become democratic. So the Germans, in particularly, egregiously miscalculated by thinking that their own very specific brand of atonement and self-reconstruction, that was really the price for returning into the fold of the West, of multilateralism, the United Nations, the EU, and NATO, was going to be the model for everybody else. I mean, that thinking, of course, matched a certain degree of wounded narcissism, for which, unfortunately, my beloved fellow Germans are somewhat, to which they are somewhat susceptible. But and I think we're currently
less so than Americans, though. I mean, Germans are certainly less narcissistic than Americans, aren't they?
I beg to disagree. I think that is one of our most significant failings, and I think that is...
What, a narcissism?
Yes, and I think that is both
love
unattractive.
Of Germanness, of themselves?
Well, a self-congratulatory sort
Germany?
of... Absolutely, a self-congratulatory... Oh God, yes, I could go into great detail, but I suspect we don't have time in this interview. But I will tell you that there is definitely a Am deutschen Wesen soll die Welt genesen, famous old quote, which is, Germanness is the cure for the rest of the world. I think that atonement, reparations, reconciliation, all of that was really, really important for Germany. Having a constitution that protected minorities against the cruelty of the majority, absolutely crucial to becoming a decent country again after World War II and the Holocaust, of course. But, I mean, all that's fine and good. Do you really have to congratulate yourself on it all the time? I don't think so, and it does gloss over the fact that it took us quite long.
Fast forward from the 1930s or 40s to 2019, wouldn't it be fair to say that of all the Western democracies, the German one seems to be working better than any other? Certainly with Brexit in the UK, Trump in the US, you will of course bring up the rise of populism in Germany, but the rise of populism in Germany is much less pronounced than it is in the UK or in the US, and the political system seems to work much better than in France. Is that fair?
Okay, there's several different things in that very long questions that I think we need to disassemble. One, the German political system. I think, yes, we have seen, it's instructive to compare the current sort of street riots of the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests in France, Brexit, and Germany. And I would say there are two things happening in France and Britain that aren't as much of a problem in Germany, which is that both in France and in Britain you have a genuine sort of destructive, dysfunctional tension between a capital that seems to have all the political resources and strategic assets, and a periphery that gets far too little of that. In France, I would add a presidential system that, while it in theory embraces the notion of separation and balance of powers, has a very strong executive and a very poor and weak parliament.
And it compounds the sort of the Paris dysfunctionality.
Exactly. In Britain, I would argue that the problem is devolution, or a lack thereof, between London and the periphery, particularly in Wales and Scotland and the border regions, where I think life is completely different than in London or in the south of England. I mean, that's a traditional historical problem for England, but it's been exacerbated, I think, here. And I think that much of what in Brexit the Brexiteers have attributed to the EU is really a failing of the British nation state. None of that, however, is to say that the German nation state doesn't have problems of its own. It was, however, designed very differently. I mean, the whole point of German constitutional reconstruction after World War II was to say, we need to have a very carefully balanced constitutional system, where with a rigid protection of minorities and the balance of powers, the independence of the judiciary, all the things that the Nazis rode roughshod over in the 1930s. And you also need to have free markets that are, however, regulated, the famous German corporatist model, in other words, strong role for the unions and works councils, and finally a decent social contract that doesn't leave, a part of the population out forever. But I think where we really went wrong, and this brings me back to my sort of point about the sort of self-congratulatory mood in Germany about 1989, is that the mistake that people made in thinking that the end of history was now here and everybody would want to be like us, and that's a mistake I think we made with regard to the Hungarians, the Poles, the Czechs, and others, who had just discovered nationalism upon being freed from the Soviet Union and were now being asked to relinquish it again in joining the EU and NATO. We did a bit of the same thing with regard to Eastern Germany. I think we sort of very grandly told the East Germans, be like us, and you'll do fine, all the while doing what here after Reconstruction, after the end of the American Civil War, was called carpetbagging. In other words, sending people from West Germany into East Germany to hoover up the best administrative and judiciary and political jobs. It's no surprise that people would resent that, even as they, celebrated their new freedoms.
What's the problem with populism, and why is it such a threat, at least in your mind, to democracy?
Well, because if you look at them carefully, if you take seriously what they say, what their magazines write, and what they say on social media, they are looking to disassemble representative democracy and institute in its stead something that I would call a mixture of plutocratic rule
So
combined with
Trump
plebiscitarian modes of democratic acclamation.
So Brexit-style Trumpism.
Well, I don't think the Brexiteers actually want to rejig the fabric of the British institutionalism.
But
I wouldn't take it that far.
But as a sort of plebiscitary style of politics.
Because I'm a lawyer by training, allow me to be precise here. I think that is really important. And I think that referenda and initiatives tend to undermine the fabric of representative democracy. And frankly, I think that is a bad thing. I think in moderation, circumscribed with very clear rules about what they can be used for or not, I think they can work. The Swiss show that. I think in a system where it's basically used by an elected politician, as David Cameron did, to punt away responsibility for a really complex and difficult and hard political decision, where there were no good choices, to the electorate, and cheered on by people whose motives, in some cases at least, I question. At least in terms of the actual leadership of the Brexiteers, and that is not to criticize the 52% of Britain who voted for it, although I wonder whether they would do so again now. That I think was a genuinely irresponsible act, and I will stand by that. I also think that we have now learned in the last 5 years that social media themselves are used as a form of daily plebiscite by those who use them rabidly. And it's, as the conspiracy theorists say, it is no coincidence that the Russians, say, have been using that kind of medium aggressively for what the strategists call hybrid warfare. And that is indeed actually what it is, because it's designed to undermine and weaken social cohesion and trust in institutions in the West.
So the title of this series is How to Fix Democracy.
Yeah.
So you've been very detailed in your analysis of what's gone wrong. How do we fix this? Do we shut social media down? Do we ban plebiscites? Do we outlaw parties that themselves want to undermine democracy? What's the solution to all this?
Right. Again, that's something I've spent a lot of time thinking about, which is sort of odd because it's really my field is foreign and security policy, and I want to make an important point here, or one at least that's important to me, but I think ought to be more generally, which is that if there's one thing that we've learned in the last decade, in the course of all these wars and the global financial crisis and the refugee crisis and so on, is that it is, I think, not possible for a Western democracy to have a legitimate foreign and security policy if its internal affairs are not seen as legitimate and effective. Yeah. That is absolutely crucial. Now back to the domestic things. I think that we aren't going to turn back the clock on social media. I mean, it's ludicrous to suggest that we should ban it.
No more trashing of these things?
Well, I mean, feel free. I'll keep mine. I need it for work. But
you could delete Facebook.
I could do many, many things, but that's neither here nor there. I think the greater point is this. I think that we need to accept that this is now part of the sort of larger fabric of our societies and deal with it. My response to it would be not to say, oh, we need more direct democracy, more referenda. No, I think that actually that overtaxes citizens who don't want to be citizens every day, who don't want to have to vote every day and to make their minds up about really complex questions. I think, if anything, we have to strengthen representative democracy. Let me take that through the three countries that I mentioned, because those are the ones that I know best. I think in Britain, genuinely, and I know that this is a discussion that the Brits have had for decades, that I would think that a dose of genuine federalism would be very healthy for Great Britain. I also think that the British case is one where you can study another problem, which is that the Brits have always had very highly respected police and domestic intelligence services, and they have had to have them because they have had all sorts of trouble with terrorism. Now, we have seen, I think, and that is not much discussed except by the real experts on these issues, and I have been listening in on that conversation.
No
that
pun
has
intended on listening in.
Yes, no pun intended, no. But I know the people who work in this field, and there are some very thoughtful people who I take very seriously. But the problem is, of course, that what that kind of preemptive care to prevent terrorism domestically means is that you strengthen domestic intelligence and police. What that means is that you are in a continuous tension with civil rights and liberties. And you have to ask yourself, and I as a constitutional lawyer to ask myself, how do you then maintain the proper balance between a strengthened executive and a strengthened secret executive that has an impact on civil liberties and the rights of Parliament and the judiciary? I think that is something one needs to take really seriously.
Okay,
we all will have to deal with that.
So in the UK, we need more of a balance between, we need more federal system.
Yes, and more of a balance between the horizontal powers. Yes.
The police services and the intelligence services. And
on the one hand, exactly.
More transparency. What about Germany and the US?
Let me briefly go to France. I think France could use a stronger parliament. Yeah? France could use a genuine counterweight to the presidency. Yeah? And I think one of the problems in France also, although that may be a harbinger of the future, is that their party system is basically the post-war party system in France has disappeared and has turned into inchoate, so very fluid movements.
Okay.
And if now moving quickly to Germany, we have been characterized not just by all these sort of institutional things that I described, but by some very strong popular parties, by strong unions, and strong churches. And all of those have been bleeding membership. Our politics, too, have become much more volatile and much more fluid. And I think that is the way it will remain. And of course, if we're honest, we have always had an extreme right-wing politics, except that in the past that was hoovered up by the Conservatives. What can we do in Germany? I think that in some ways, the Germans really did think they had the perfect system and they would never need to fix it or to rejig it. Certainly that was the impression I got when I was going to law school, and I always thought that was utterly wrong and highly complacent. Let me give you a very...
So maybe Germans should be more self-critical. Isn't that a very German
Absolutely, but
German position?
Look, I'll give you an example and you'll see what I mean. I've got lots of lawyer friends still, and I saw a couple of them a couple of weeks ago on a trip to Germany. And they told me that in Berlin, the prosecutors of the city of Berlin, you've got four prosecutors sharing one computer. Okay. No wonder prosecutions are piling up, people's cases aren't being decided, and there is a sense that justice is not being administered. On a much larger level than this sort of anecdotal evidence, Germany has disinvested in infrastructure arguably for 2 decades in its, I think, besotted quest for a balanced national budget.
Yeah.
Its obsession with a balanced national budget, and as a result, we've disinvested in national roads, in the train system, in broadband, and hospitals in rural areas, bus stations in rural areas, and of course, it is well known all over the world that we are incapable of building a national airport. And so that kind of stuff annoys people.
So we have Germany to help fix democracy in Germany. We need more infrastructure, particularly maybe on the digital front.
Right, now the US.
And the US.
Now the
Finally,
US. Okay.
the US.
All right, I've lived here as a child. I went to graduate school here, and now I've been living here for 4.5 years. And I've got 2 or 3 theories that I will throw in front of you. One is that I think that this country, at least in my lifetime, has tended, while it has had wild pendulum swings out to the left or to the right.
Yeah.
You've had, Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, you've had Johnson's Great Society, you've had the Reagan Revolution. You always could count on the pendulum somehow swinging back. I think it swung out to the far right under the Reagan Revolution and never came back, really. And as a result, what you have here, and that is completely different from Europe, you have a delegitimization, a devaluation of the state as a provider of public goods. I know that sounds very abstract, but basically what that means is the state's not supposed to get involved in education, in building roads, in building schools, in building hospitals. Leave that to companies, and if not, society, charity will take care of it. That would be unconscionable in Europe. Although there have been political movements, libertarians, though they're rarer in Europe, who have espoused just that. And I think that that has genuinely led to a fraying of the social fabric here and to the polarization. Then there is much more democracy, direct democracy, than Americans know, particularly at the local and state level.
For better or worse?
For worse, mostly. I think very often it's pseudo-democratic because people are burdened with a huge quantity of these decisions, which are very often brought in by special interests. There is limited public debate, and then they get a ballot sheet every 2 years that's as long as their arms, and they don't know what they're deciding, so either they just check something randomly or they don't decide at all.
So it's a kind of corruption of Tocqueville.
Yes, I think it's a genuine fraying of the institutions and processes of representative democracy in ways that Americans aren't aware of.
So more state in America and less direct democracy.
Can I just say one thing? Gerrymandering, one of the, I think, acknowledged ills of American democracy, and one that has been done both by Republicans and by Democrats, is done by direct democratic votes, by referenda.
So it takes away any interest, it sort of takes away the functionality of voting.
Yeah,
it becomes pointless.
Precisely.
Okay, so these have been great, Constance. You've really got into the weeds on Germany, France,
I'm a German after
UK
all.
and Germany. Yeah, you're a German. Don't always apologize for being German.
I wasn't apologizing.
Finally,
What's the difference?
Stand back from all this. One meta point that we can, standing back from the weeds, from the details, from the legal or the political or the plebiscitary systems, one thing that can help fix democracy in the West generally. One thing.
Well, I mean, this will seem counterintuitive after all I've said. I am really worried. I'm also sort of cheerful about this because I think that this is genuinely a time when I'm no longer just being asked to be an heir. In other words, to sort of carefully, to value what I've inherited, but by God, never to touch it. I think that our generation is genuinely being asked to be architects of our own fate and of our own democracies.
And that's a good thing.
That's a good thing. I like that. It makes me much more of a subject. Before that, I felt, it didn't really matter what I thought. Now I think it does.
So the good news is that we can all be architects of a healthier, more functional, more working democracy.
Yes, exactly. And I think there's work to be done, and you know what, let's just do it.